Inside a tense federal chamber in Washington, D.C., Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett directly confronts Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, exposing deep-rooted corruption in the judiciary. Thomas mocks her evidence and tries to bury the truth beneath status and smug authority. But within minutes, Jasmine unleashes a trove of undeniable proof that shakes the entire room. The silence turns deadly as two FBI agents appear at the door, no longer observers, but executors of accountability. This isn't just a challenge to one man. It's a direct strike at the myth of untouchable justice. If the highest judge in the land can fall, what other giants are still standing on lies? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the marble archway of Capitol Hill's most restricted chamber, the air felt heavier than usual, thick with tension, judgment, and something unspoken. Jasmine Crockett stood alone at the witness table, framed by two microphones and a silent red countdown clock. 90:00. No press, no cameras. This wasn't a hearing for public consumption. It was a surgical strike behind closed doors. Her navy suit was crisp, her posture precise. Across from her sat 12 members of the Judicial Ethics Oversight Committee, their faces blank, their authority absolute. But the real shock came when the rear doors creaked open and Justice Clarence Thomas entered. He was not listed on the docket. His presence had been approved only hours prior, under the guise of wanting to clarify media distortions. Now he sat at the head of the chamber, robed, composed, and utterly unreadable. Jasmine's eyes met his for only a second. That was enough. Two black figures in American law, but worlds apart. One had spent 3 decades fortifying power through silence. The other had risen by shattering it with truth. Clarence took his seat without acknowledging her. His presence was deliberate. This was a warning. "You want to bring a case against the court?" his silence seemed to ask. "Then face the court itself." Jasmine didn't flinch. She reached for her folder and waited. Around them, the committee leaned forward. The microphones came alive with a soft click. The clock remained cold and steady. 90 minutes. 2 lives. 1 confrontation no camera would capture. But the consequences would shake the foundation of American justice. She had survived the silence. Now came the strike. Jasmine had only just begun to peel back the first layer of what she'd uncovered. A trail of undisclosed luxury gifts, 3 trips to be exact, when Clarence Thomas made his move. He didn't wait for her to finish, didn't even bother pretending to hear her evidence out. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose like he'd just heard a poorly rehearsed play. His voice broke through the chamber with a practiced mix of sarcasm and superiority. "Are these the infamous vacation allegations?" The words dripped with disdain, not curiosity. He didn't ask because he wanted an answer. He asked to establish dominance, to send a clear message. This is not your courtroom. This is not your game. But Jasmine Crockett didn't look away. She turned the page with deliberate calm, her voice steady as concrete. Between 2017 and 2021, Justice Thomas accepted at least 3 luxury trips, each funded by Mr. Harlan Crow, none of which appear on public financial disclosures. The room began to shift, not physically but in energy. What had started as uncomfortable formality was now something else. Confrontation. Private flights, super yachts, 5-star accommodations. No records, no recusals. No transparency, she added, sliding photocopies toward the committee clerk. No theatrics, no hyperbole. Just receipts, just truth. And that's when he struck again. "And you pulled that from where exactly, Ms. Crockett? Twitter? TikTok? Or one of those activist blogs that confuse outrage with evidence?" The sentence hit the chamber like a slap. Not loud, not shouted, but surgical in its cruelty. Laced with condescension, intentional. The kind of dismissal Jasmine had grown up recognizing in boardrooms, classrooms, courtrooms, where truth wasn't denied outright, it was mocked into irrelevance, where voices like hers weren't silenced with force, but with smirks. The insult wasn't just about the data, it was about her intellect, her credibility, her place at this table, a place she had fought for, tooth and nail, against the current of every stereotype he'd just used to try and drown her. A few members chuckled. Low, strained, instinctive laughter. Born not of humor, but tension. A laugh to keep from reacting. One committee member shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Another stared down at his notes, pretending not to have heard. It was the kind of moment everyone in the room knew was wrong, but no one wanted to interrupt. And in that silence, the message was clear. Clarence Thomas still held the floor. But Jasmine Crockett did not retreat. She stood motionless, grounded, not frozen, but planted. Her hands rested on the edge of the folder, her nails just barely digging into the stiff paper. The fluorescent light caught the glint in her eyes, and that was the only part of her that moved, her gaze which sharpened like steel. She didn't interrupt. She didn't protest, because she understood the moment better than anyone else in that room. She knew the impulse to respond in anger would be turned into a headline before she could finish a sentence. She also knew the silence that follows a cruel joke could be even more damning if you held it long enough. This wasn't new. She had walked into rooms where she was the only woman, the only Black American, the only person willing to say what others whispered in hallways. She had been questioned, belittled, cut off, underestimated, not because she lacked facts, but because facts spoken from her mouth carried a different weight. And now, in front of one of the most powerful men in the judiciary, she was watching the exact same dynamic play out, this time televised in the minds of 12 ethics judges who didn't need cameras to feel the gravity. She had brought them facts, but Thomas wanted to turn it into theater. Let him, she thought. Let him smirk. Let him posture. Let him remind the room how far power can twist a man away from principle. Because every joke he made was just another crack in the bench he thought unbreakable. Every insult a signal to the people watching, not on TV, but in person, in history, that even a Supreme Court justice could shrink himself to avoid facing a page of truth. So Jasmine said nothing, not because she lacked words, but because the fire in her silence said more than any rebuttal ever could. And that fire was only just starting to rise. But the silence wasn't defeat, it was fuel. And Clarence Thomas mistook it for weakness. He had seen too many people back down in moments like this. He believed she would do the same, that she'd avert her eyes, soften her tone, maybe even apologize for stepping too far into territory he considered sacred. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't built for retreat. She stood her ground, unblinking, while he shifted tactics. Not to defend himself, but to dismantle her. Not to answer the evidence, but to erase the person presenting it. He leaned forward slightly, fingers pressed together like a priest delivering a sermon, and said, "Let me remind this chamber that not all criticisms are created equal, and not all critics arrive with clean hands." The room stilled. The statement wasn't abstract, it was aimed. This committee may wish to consider the perspective of a freshman congresswoman, a former public defender no less, attempting to lecture a sitting justice of the Supreme Court on what constitutes ethics. His tone was cool, almost bored, like a professor dismissing a student's poorly written paper. But every syllable carried razor wire. His goal wasn't just to defend his name, it was to shrink her inside her own testimony. His voice didn't rise, but its weight crushed the space around them. A woman whose rise began in local protest circles and courtroom activism, and who now carries herself as if longevity equals legitimacy. He didn't need to say more. His tone did the work for him. It told the room that Jasmine Crockett was temporary, that she was noise-dressed in formality, that whatever she had to say, it wasn't coming from a seat he respected. And then the final blow. Perhaps experience in constitutional law should come from applying it, not shouting it into cameras. He wasn't defending his record. He was declaring her unworthy to question it. It was a classic move, one she had seen her entire career. Strip the speaker of moral authority, not by disproving their evidence, but by discrediting their path. Make them feel like outsiders, like intruders in a room built for real thinkers. He hadn't addressed the 3 luxury trips. He hadn't touched the financial records. He hadn't disputed the flight logs or the hotel invoices. He simply decided they didn't matter because she didn't matter. And that, Jasmine understood, was the oldest tactic in power. He reduced her entire career to 3 labels: freshman, public defender, activist. As if those things weren't battles. As if they weren't scars earned in rooms just like this one. Rooms where women like her were told to wait their turn, sit back, and clap quietly while history made its deals behind closed doors. Clarence Thomas hadn't looked at her and seen a colleague. He had looked at her and seen a threat, because she hadn't waited her turn. She had taken her shot, and she had facts. What he also didn't realize was how many times she'd been here before. Not in this room, not with this man, but in this dynamic. The one where power tried to make her forget who she was, where old voices, safe behind walls of prestige, tried to make her feel grateful just to be present. But she wasn't here for permission. She wasn't here for acceptance. She was here for truth. And Thomas, for all his robes and titles, had just shown how deeply afraid he was of it. Because only a man who fears the mirror tries so hard to break the one holding it. But the blade he tried to bury in her past only sharpened her resolve. He had weaponized her story, framed her rise from public defender to congresswoman as a liability, not a legacy. He wanted the room to see her as an anomaly, accidental in her ambition, accidental in her access to this chamber. But Jasmine Crockett knew exactly who she was and why she was there. She stood in rooms like this not because someone opened the door, but because she kicked it open, one footstep at a time, over years of being talked over, discredited, and diminished. She recognized the tone Clarence Thomas used because it was the same one she'd heard her entire career. Masked in formality, sharpened by superiority, designed to remind her of her place. But unlike so many before her, she wasn't trained to stay small when a man in robes tried to shrink her. She didn't rise to meet his tone. She flattened it, with a sentence that felt like a verdict. Jasmine inhaled, deep and slow, not for control, but for impact. She made sure he was looking straight at her, and then, with a calmness that didn't need a gavel to command silence, she said, "And I'm here because people like you think that's a weakness." The words hung in the air like smoke after a shot, unmoving, undeniable. Every syllable struck with surgical precision, not raised in volume, but in weight. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Her voice was steady, almost quiet, as if daring the room to lean in closer, and it did. The committee members didn't speak. Even the air vents seemed to fall silent. No shifting papers, no tapping pens. Just the uncomfortable stillness of 12 people realizing the balance of power had just tipped. Not with volume, but with truth. The atmosphere transformed. The room that had moments ago been a theater for Thomas's performance now felt like a courtroom in recess after a devastating cross-examination. The shift was so subtle it was seismic. One committee member, previously impassive, looked down at his notes as if to avoid meeting Jasmine's eyes. Another uncrossed his legs slowly, nervously. No one moved too quickly. No one wanted to be the first to break the silence. And across the table, Clarence Thomas sat back, no longer leaning forward in control, but pulling away from the heat he didn't expect. He had underestimated her, not just her skill or her poise, but her origin. Because what he tried to frame as a flaw, her years fighting for people the system ignored, was in fact her armor. Her past wasn't a stain. It was the reason she could walk into the highest halls of power and not flinch when a Supreme Court justice tried to dress her down. She had seen worse. She had survived worse. And that survival, that lived understanding of justice denied and justice delayed, wasn't just experience. It was credibility. And at that moment, she had more of it than he did. The silence didn't last forever, but it lasted long enough to remind everyone who truly owned the room. It was the kind of silence that didn't beg to be filled, but dared anyone to try. Clarence Thomas hadn't responded, not to her sentence, not to her stare, not to the subtle shift of weight in the chamber after Jasmine Crockett reminded him that what he called weakness was, in fact, the very reason she was here. But time, like power, keeps moving, relentless and indifferent. The chairman glanced at the clock, cleared his throat, and announced the session was drawing to a close. Voices around the table stirred, hands reached for folders, and aides leaned forward to collect materials. The committee was preparing to exit quietly, letting the moment dissolve back into protocol. That was when Jasmine spoke, her voice not raised but unmistakably firm. "Mr. Chairman," she said, "I'd like to request 10 minutes before we close." There was a pause. Not long, just long enough to register the discomfort. The kind of pause that suggests people already think they know what's coming and don't want to be bothered with it. A few committee members nodded without much interest. One of them gave a soft sigh and said, "Granted." The expectation in the room was clear. She'd offer some final words, maybe a soft rebuke, maybe even an olive branch. Something symbolic, something safe. Even Clarence Thomas, still seated in the center of the semicircle, shifted in his chair with the kind of practiced detachment that said, "Let her finish so we can move on." He didn't know that Jasmine hadn't come to end this quietly. She had come to end it truthfully. Her movements were calm, but every inch of them felt loaded with purpose. She reached into her briefcase, not into the stack of materials she'd used earlier, not the color-coded files, not the statutory references, but into the thin red folder that had remained untouched all day. Unlabeled, unassuming, hidden in plain sight. Her fingers closed around it, and she brought it out with care. Not theatrical, not rushed, but like someone pulling the pin on something that couldn't be undone once opened. She laid it on the table in front of her, ran a hand across its smooth surface, and opened it with slow, deliberate precision. The room shifted again. The energy didn't spike. It constricted. People stopped shuffling. The aides paused mid-motion. Even the stenographer slowed her fingers, as if she sensed the rhythm of the room had changed and didn't want to miss a beat. Jasmine didn't look up immediately. She began removing the contents, sheet by sheet, each one laid in front of her, like she was building a map out of redacted truth. There were wire transfers, bank statements, cross-border financial movements, trust fund disbursements. The paper was ordinary, but its contents were not. At the top of nearly every document, one name echoed: Virginia Guinea Thomas. And suddenly, no one was reaching for their folders anymore. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The silence around her gave her words a kind of gravity that no gavel could match. She looked directly at the chairman first, then slowly turned her gaze to the rest of the committee, and finally let her eyes rest on Clarence Thomas. "I didn't want to believe this," she began, her voice low but cutting through the room like a violin string pulled too tight. "But this country deserves the truth." There was no mistaking her tone. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't performative. It was restrained, and that made it more dangerous, because she wasn't calling for outrage. She wasn't chasing headlines. She was holding a mirror, and she knew what the reflection showed. The documents she had laid before them told a quiet but damning story. A family trust, registered in Delaware under layers of legal shielding, had received significant financial contributions from several political donors with known interest before the Supreme Court. That trust, managed by third-party fiduciaries, had issued payments directly to entities tied to Guinea Thomas. On paper, it looked like passive income, but in reality, it was anything but passive. It was calculated, disguised, and never disclosed. Jasmine didn't rattle off dates and numbers. They were right there in front of everyone. Her message wasn't in the math. It was in the moral rot hiding behind it. She took a step forward, not toward the committee, but just far enough to make her presence undeniable. "We've been told over and over again," she said, "that the judiciary must remain impartial, that the bench is sacred, that we must never politicize it. But what happens when the rot isn't coming from the outside, but from the inside?" Her voice never rose. It didn't have to. The air around her did the heavy lifting. She wasn't asking a question for debate. She was stating a reality no one in the room wanted to be the first to acknowledge. Clarence Thomas didn't speak. His posture remained still, but his hands, which had remained folded most of the day, now separated ever so slightly. One thumb tapped rhythmically against the polished wood of the table. Small, nervous, unintended. Jasmine let the silence return. Let it settle again, this time with weight, not emptiness. She knew what it meant to be the only one willing to say it out loud. She had lived that her entire life. She wasn't naive. She knew the odds, the legacy, the machine. But what she held in her hands wasn't theory. It wasn't hearsay. It was proof. Not enough for conviction, perhaps, but more than enough for clarity. "Let me be clear," she said. "I'm not here to destroy a man. I'm here to protect a system that can no longer survive on silence." At that moment, the only sound in the room was the quiet whir of the air conditioning. No papers turned, no chairs shifted, no one interrupted. Because even if they wanted to, they couldn't. Because Jasmine Crockett had done what no one else had dared. She brought the truth into the room and made it impossible to look away. The weight of her final sentence hadn't even settled before she reached for the screen remote. There was no dramatic flourish, no declaration. Just the quiet confidence of someone who knew the truth and knew it didn't need embellishment to hit like thunder. Jasmine Crockett's hand moved slowly, deliberately, toward the small remote beside her stack of documents. Her fingers paused over the first button. Around her, the room remained paralyzed, locked in the aftershock of what had just been revealed. But Jasmine understood something crucial. Impact wasn't just in what you said, it was in what you showed. So without raising her voice, without warning, she clicked the button once. The lights dimmed slightly as the monitor on the far wall came to life. The screen blinked, then revealed two emails projected in stark white text over black backgrounds. There were no theatrics, just raw, unfiltered data now floating in the air like smoke after a gunshot. No one moved. On the left, a message dated 7 months prior from Virginia Ginny Thomas to a known political action committee leader. The subject line read, "Re-strategic contributions prior to ruling." The language in the body was polite, veiled, but unmistakably transactional. It referenced timing of support aligning with favorable decisions and ensuring judicial understanding of long-term expectations. The wording was cautious, but the intent was clear to anyone who'd ever read between lines of political doublespeak. And Jasmine didn't offer commentary. She let it sit. Then the screen on the right, a second email, shorter, blunt, sent just 6 weeks earlier. Subject line, Crockett, contain or delay. The sender again, Ginny Thomas. But this one wasn't careful. This one didn't dance around the message. It hit straight through the center of the room with a single line. "Clarence says Jasmine Crockett is a problem. She talks fast and knows too much." The silence in the chamber turned hard. No longer just uncomfortable, but dangerous. No one reached for water. No one shifted in their seat. Eyes darted from the screen to Jasmine, then to Clarence Thomas, who remained frozen. But for the first time that day, his expression betrayed him. His carefully built fortress of stillness cracked. His jaw tensed. His right thumb twitched against the side of the table. And his eyes, those famously impassive eyes, narrowed ever so slightly as he looked at the screen, then at her. Not in defiance, not in control, but in recognition. She found it. The committee members, once relaxed, detached, now leaned forward like men watching a wall begin to crumble. One of them, a gray-haired senator who hadn't spoken all day, finally broke the silence. "Do you have metadata for those emails?" His voice sounded thinner than usual, as if he already knew the answer, but needed to ask it anyway. Jasmine didn't miss a beat. "Verified," she replied, her tone razor-sharp. "Chain of custody established by 2 independent forensics teams." That was it. That was the moment the room crossed a line it couldn't walk back from. The chairman's face had gone pale beneath his neatly trimmed beard. His voice cracked slightly as he said, 15-minute recess, effective immediately. It didn't sound like a procedural pause. It sounded like a man trying to stop an avalanche by naming it. Suddenly the room erupted, not in shouting, but in quiet chaos. Committee members stood too quickly. Folders were closed with shaking hands. Aides whispered urgently to one another while glancing toward exits. No one wanted to say out loud what the screen had just screamed into the bones of the chamber. This wasn't a political spat anymore. This was potential criminal exposure. And in the eye of the storm stood Jasmine, calm, unmoving, shoulders back, as if she had been waiting years for someone to finally try to bury her with silence so she could answer with fire. Clarence Thomas stood slowly, a beat behind the others. His face had returned to its usual mask, but the movements betrayed him. There was no longer the slow confidence of someone controlling the room. There was calculation. There was discomfort. There was fear, carefully folded behind a practiced brow. He turned toward the private door to the rear hallway, a routine exit for officials needing a break. But just before his hand reached the handle, two men in dark suits appeared in the shadows behind the frosted glass window. They weren't congressional aides. They weren't interns or escorts. They were FBI agents. They didn't speak. They didn't move aggressively, but they were standing precisely where they needed to be, between Clarence Thomas and whatever lay beyond the door. Their presence wasn't loud, but it was loud enough, because everyone in the room now knew what Jasmine had suspected for months. This wasn't just a matter of improper disclosure. This wasn't just political optics. This was federal. Jasmine remained still, watching him, not with smugness, not with vengeance, but with the kind of cold, clear awareness you only get when you've been ignored for too long. She had been underestimated. She had been mocked. She had been dismissed as too emotional, too dramatic, too political. But what she had brought to this room wasn't drama. It was evidence. And now, with two agents waiting in silence behind the glass, the system that once told her to be quiet had no choice but to listen. Because when a Supreme Court justice tries to dismiss you with a smirk, but the emails tell another story, and the agents are already in position, you don't need to raise your voice. You just let the truth speak louder than all of them. And as the FBI agents stood behind that door like shadows given purpose, Jasmine didn't flinch. Because this moment had been built long before today. It hadn't begun in that courtroom, nor in the chaos of the hearing's final minutes. It had begun months earlier, in quiet conversations conducted far from the public eye. Long before she'd opened that red folder, before the screen flickered with damning emails, Jasmine Crockett had already started laying the tracks. Because she understood what it meant to go up against a pillar, a man whose name wasn't just known, but protected. She also understood the difference between shouting into a void and building a case that couldn't be ignored. And so she did what most wouldn't dare. She went looking for the truth in the one place it wasn't supposed to exist. Inside the machine. It started with whispers. Two former Supreme Court clerks, both men who had served under Justice Thomas at different points in their careers, came to her independently. Neither had spoken publicly. Both had left the court disillusioned. What they shared was not just information, but conviction. One had reviewed internal memos that never made it into case files. The other had overheard things in private chambers, remarks that weren't illegal, but revealing. Jasmine met with each of them separately. She didn't push. She asked. She listened. And eventually she earned their trust. One of them, the younger of the two, soft-spoken and brilliant, had gone a step further, without prompting. Without backup. He had hit record during a private meeting at a club in Northern Virginia. And what he captured changed everything. The voice on the tape was unmistakable. Clarence Thomas, speaking to a conservative megadonor known for shaping judicial narratives from behind the scenes. The setting was informal. The tone was relaxed. But the content was crystal clear. Thomas, referencing an upcoming case on environmental deregulation, chuckled and said, "Let's just say I make sure the rulings come out clean, and you make sure the wheels keep turning." It wasn't a direct admission of bribery, but it was something more damning in a way. The casual ease of someone who no longer saw a line between power and influence. Jasmine had replayed that clip more times than she could count, not because she needed to confirm what she heard, but because she had to prepare herself for the storm it would unleash. She didn't run to the press. She didn't leak it. She did what prosecutors dream witnesses would do. She built a process. Quietly, methodically. She hand-delivered the audio file, along with a stack of supporting documentation, to the Office of Public Integrity at the Department of Justice. No fanfare, no entourage, just a sealed envelope, a chain of custody form, and a voice memo she recorded for the record. This isn't personal, it's systemic. Do what the Constitution requires. The rest is yours. The federal prosecutor who received it didn't ask many questions. He didn't need to. The moment he heard Thomas's voice, the air in the room shifted. He promised a formal review. Jasmine didn't press for a timeline. She already knew hers. Weeks later, she submitted a redacted version of the materials to the Judicial Ethics Committee, the same body now seated, frozen, in the hearing chamber. At the time, most members had been skeptical. Some had warned her off the record. You're playing with fire. But Jasmine knew better. She'd spent her entire career learning how to walk through flames without catching. The question wasn't whether the system would try to protect one of its own. The question was, what happens when someone refuses to let it? Now wait, with the hearing adjourned for a tense 15-minute recess, the past collided with the present. Thomas had stood slowly, carefully, the polished calm of a man trained to never reveal too much. But Jasmine saw it, the tightness in his jaw, the delay in his step, the subtle glance toward the side door where the FBI agents now stood waiting. They weren't blocking his exit, not yet, but their presence was a signal. The threshold between immunity and accountability had narrowed. And in that moment, a truth settled over the room heavier than any accusation. Power doesn't protect you when the facts are finally louder than your title. As the room emptied in silence, one veteran congressman, a man who had served through 5 administrations and survived more hearings than he could count, leaned slightly toward his aide and whispered, almost reverently, "I think we're about to witness history." He didn't say it for effect. He said it like a man who had seen too many moments slip into obscurity, and finally recognized one that would not. And as the weight of those whispered words, "I think we're about to witness history," still lingered in the stale air of the chamber, the next moment came not with sirens or shouting, but with paper. A junior clerk, barely older than a law school graduate, entered from the side hallway, his steps fast but composed, his right hand gripping a sealed envelope like it carried something heavier than words. The room hadn't fully reset from recess. Committee members were still standing, murmuring in hushed tones, while Clarence Thomas remained near the bench, his posture taut, his face now visibly locked in guarded calculation. The young clerk didn't hesitate. He bypassed aides and protocols and made his way straight to the secondary chair, the vice chair of the committee, seated temporarily in place of the official presiding officer who had stepped away during the break. With a whisper and a nod, he handed over the envelope. It was marked with the insignia of the Department of Justice and stamped "Priority Hand Delivery Only." The vice chair opened it without ceremony. His eyes scanned the page, but his expression said more than the letter ever could. His jaw clenched, his brows knit together, and when he looked up, it was not confusion that flashed across his face. It was finality. He cleared his throat, enough to quiet the half-dozen side conversations echoing through the wood-paneled chamber. Slowly, deliberately, he read the statement. By request of the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Division, effective immediately, Justice Clarence Thomas is to be temporarily suspended from participating in any internal or federal investigations involving political finance, lobbying influence, or judicial disclosure violations until further review. The words hung in the room like a dropped ceiling tile, sudden, loud in its silence, impossible to ignore. Clarence Thomas moved quickly. He stood, eyes narrowing, robes slightly billowing with the sudden shift in posture. "This is outrageous," he barked, his voice fuller now, as if volume could restore authority. "I will not stand here while my name is stripped on the basis of innuendo and political theatrics. I demand the opportunity to respond, and I reject the premise of this." But his voice cracked slightly at the end, betraying the very control he was desperate to maintain. He looked toward the committee, then toward the envelope on the table as if willing it to disappear. But the message had already taken root. The suspension was not symbolic. It was binding, and everyone in the room knew it. That was when Jasmine rose, not with urgency, not with self-congratulation, just a quiet, unshakable resolve. Her hands remained at her sides. She didn't adjust her blazer. She didn't gather notes. She simply stood, and the entire chamber turned toward her. Even Thomas, who had spent the better part of the day trying to bury her beneath sarcasm and legacy, went still. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried, like a quiet verdict echoing off marble walls. "No one stands above the law," she said, every syllable sharp. "Not even those who've spent their lives holding its gavel." The words didn't need applause. They weren't designed for spectacle. They were a reminder, a reckoning, a line in the sand that had been drawn not with drama, but with evidence and courage and months of work behind doors where no one thought she'd ever gain entry. The room froze again, not because of fear, but because something irreversible had just occurred. A Supreme Court justice had been formally removed from influence in a federal investigation, and the woman who had spent a lifetime being told to wait her turn had just moved the system itself. It wasn't defiance, it was justice, and it was only beginning. The words had barely faded from the air. No one stands above the law, when movement returned to the room like a pulse snapping back to life. But it was different now, slower, heavier, not the fluid, rehearsed choreography of government proceedings, but something raw and unscripted. Clarence Thomas stood still at first, as if unwilling to accept what had just occurred. His shoulders, once broad with decades of unshaken authority, now sat ever so slightly lower. Not bent, not broken, but burdened. The envelope from the DOJ still sat on the committee table, untouched since it was opened, but its presence seemed to radiate through the room like a legal detonation, silencing old hierarchies. Everyone could feel it. The structure had cracked, and though Thomas remained physically upright, the image, the myth, was beginning to fall. Then he moved, just one step, controlled, measured, deliberate. Not toward Jasmine, not toward the committee, but toward the private exit, a door he had walked through many times, always alone, always untouched. The agents flanked him but didn't press. They didn't need to. His name might still be etched in marble somewhere above a courthouse door, but in this room, at this moment, he was just a man facing consequences. Still, legacy dies slowly. Before stepping out, he turned, not sharply, but with the weight of a man who had something left to say and nowhere left to say it. His eyes found Jasmine. No more smirking, no more subtle condescension. Now it was something stripped down, tired, defiant, wounded, and his voice came low, half a whisper, half a challenge. Did you do this for attention, Congresswoman? For your name? Your platform? Your brand? It wasn't a question. Not really. It was the last tool in the belt of power, minimization. Not of the facts, not of the evidence, but of her. It was the implication that a woman like Jasmine Crockett couldn't possibly stand toe-to-toe with a Supreme Court justice without an ulterior motive, that her integrity must be a mask, that her purpose must be performance. But Jasmine Crockett had heard this tone her entire life. She had heard it in underfunded courtrooms where her clients sat in orange jumpsuits while prosecutors mispronounced their names. She had heard it in backroom meetings on Capitol Hill where senior lawmakers chuckled and called her firebrand instead of colleague. She had heard it in the echoes of her own doubt, back when she wasn't sure if telling the truth out loud was worth the price it always demanded. So she didn't bristle. She didn't lash out. She stood. She faced him fully, her voice quiet but unwavering, rooted like stone in a storm. I did this for the people you forgot. The words didn't hit like a punch. They landed like a truth he already knew, but had spent years denying. And suddenly the courtroom didn't feel like a place of grandeur. It felt like a reckoning. It felt like clarity. Because the people she named without naming, the forgotten, weren't ghosts. They were real. They were watching. And in that moment, Clarence Thomas had no answer for them. He didn't speak again. His lips pressed together. His eyes dropped, not to the floor, but away from hers. And then he turned. The agents followed without touching him. The room remained utterly silent, but the sound of his departure, his shoes tapping out a steady echoing rhythm, rang louder than any gavel. Every person watched him leave, not out of spite, not out of revenge, but because they knew they were watching something unprecedented. A man who had built a fortress of silence around himself for decades was now walking out of a courtroom, not as an untouchable figure, but as a man finally touched by the system he once ruled from above. He wasn't cuffed, but he was surrounded. He wasn't dragged, but he was escorted. And though no one said it aloud, it hung in the air with suffocating certainty. This was accountability, and it was long overdue. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She stood as the door closed behind him, as the murmurs slowly returned, as the committee tried to gather itself under the weight of what had just transpired. She didn't gloat. She didn't even smile. Because this wasn't victory, it was vindication. Not for her, for them. The voters no one visited. The communities no one counted. The defendants buried under bad precedent. The whistleblowers crushed by procedure. She had carried their names in silence. And now, without raising her voice, she had carved them into history. She turned slowly, eyes still fixed on the door that had just closed behind him. And in that silence, she reminded everyone, justice doesn't require thunder. Sometimes it just walks out quietly with every eye watching. And as the door closed behind Clarence Thomas, carrying decades of silence with it, the world outside was already beginning to tremble. By the next morning, the shock waves had ruptured the surface of Washington, D.C., and spilled into every newsroom, kitchen table, and courtroom across the country. What had started as a closed-door ethics hearing had transformed overnight into a national reckoning. Networks abandoned scheduled coverage to run wall-to-wall analysis. Headlines lit up digital billboards in Times Square and scrolled across the bottom of televisions in diners in rural Ohio. The tone wasn't speculative, it was seismic. Supreme Court scandal rocks judiciary. Justice suspended amid financial probe. Crockett challenges the bench and wins round one. From the polished wood of the Supreme Court chamber to the cracked sidewalks of forgotten neighborhoods, people were watching, and people were choosing sides. Outside the Supreme Court building, where marble columns had long stood as a symbol of impenetrable stability, reality cracked open. Protesters and counter-protesters began arriving before dawn. By noon, the steps were swarmed with voices, some hoarse with outrage, some trembling with vindication. Young lawyers held printouts of the leaked financial records and screenshots of Jasmine Crockett, standing with her hand resting lightly on the red folder. Older activists held faded photographs of cases long buried, families torn apart by rulings that had favored wealth over truth. One man held up a sign with nothing but a quote from the hearing. "I did this for the people you forgot." That line had already burned itself into the national memory, but it wasn't unity. Inside Congress, the storm fractured along familiar lines. Conservative lawmakers rushed to the defense of Justice Thomas with a precision that suggested forewarning. Senator Gordon Holt appeared before the press with a scowl and declared, "This was not justice, this was theater. An ambush on the integrity of the highest court in the land, orchestrated by a woman looking to make a name for herself." Representative Caroline Marin was more direct. This was never about ethics. This was about vengeance, optics, and ambition. That afternoon, a closed-door meeting of the Republican Judiciary Caucus erupted into a shouting match over whether to back Thomas fully or demand a quiet resignation. But while politicians scrambled to contain the fire, the public fanned it with something far more dangerous than partisanship: clarity. 3 major polling groups conducted rapid overnight surveys, and by mid-morning the results were in. 68% of Americans supported a formal criminal investigation into Clarence Thomas's undisclosed financial ties and potential abuse of judicial power. Among independents, that number climbed to 74%. Even among registered Republicans, 42% agreed that serious questions remain and merit full investigation. The numbers rattled Capitol Hill, because this wasn't just outrage, it was consensus. And consensus in a nation fractured by noise is harder to kill than a headline. Cable news studios became war rooms. Legal experts pulled out dusty law school texts to explain judicial ethics rules that had never been enforced at this level. Scholars debated the constitutional process for impeaching a Supreme Court justice, something attempted only once in American history and never successfully. Editors scrambled to write timelines of Thomas's career. Some pointed to the Anita Hill hearings, others to his rulings on corporate immunity. But none of that history could drown out the present. The question on everyone's lips wasn't, "How did we get here?" It was, "What happens now?" Inside the Supreme Court itself, panic turned inward. Staffers began calling in sick. Clerks whispered to one another in stairwells. The Chief Justice held an emergency closed-door meeting with constitutional advisors and outside ethics counsel. Sources leaked that morale had plummeted and that internal discussions were no longer about optics. They were about survival. No justice commented publicly, But within the walls of One First Street, the institution felt less like a pillar and more like a dam cracking under pressure. The ruling elite, who had long believed themselves beyond the reach of scrutiny, were discovering, in real time, that scrutiny had arrived. And what shook them most was not the scandal itself, it was the face behind it. Jasmine Crockett had said little since the hearing. She hadn't gone on morning talk shows. She hadn't posted a celebratory statement. Her office released only a single-line response to press inquiries. "We stand by the record." That silence made more noise than any interview could have, because everyone now knew that she hadn't walked into that chamber looking for a headline. She had walked in with evidence, and she had let that evidence speak louder than her name. Still, not everyone believed her. Whispers ran like wildfire through the backrooms of Washington, that she was a political opportunist, that the hearing had been a trap, that someone must have planted the documents, that no freshman congresswoman could have navigated a minefield this deadly unless someone else had pulled the strings. But those whispers, however loud in power circles, could not override the visual truth replayed on every television across the country. Jasmine Crockett, standing alone, across from a Supreme Court justice, unmoved, unshaken, and unwilling to back down. Back in her district office in Texas, phones rang without pause. Not with threats, not with criticism, but with gratitude. A retired teacher called in and simply said, "Tell her thank you. I never thought I'd see someone do what we all talk about at our dinner tables." A group of law students from Detroit sent flowers with a note. "You reminded us why we started studying the law in the first place." Parents emailed to say their daughters had watched the hearing and asked for copies of the Constitution. Staffers printed everyone. But not all messages were encouragement. A man from Virginia left a voicemail calling her a traitor. Another email arrived with a single sentence: "Sleep lightly. The robes don't forget." Her team elevated threats to Capitol Police, who quietly increased her protection detail. Jasmine barely acknowledged it, because the fear wasn't new. The resistance wasn't unexpected. She had simply decided long ago that truth was worth more than comfort. And now the country was catching up. Even inside the Department of Justice, the tone shifted. Senior officials held internal strategy sessions late into the night. The Public Integrity Division had already launched a preliminary case file. The Attorney General, normally cautious with press appearances, made a brief statement at a podium that afternoon. "The department has received credible materials related to the financial conduct of Justice Clarence Thomas," he said. "We will follow the law, wherever it leads." No embellishment, no apology, just momentum. The kind Jasmine had known was possible, if someone had the spine to start the avalanche. And quietly, in circles where power brokers talk in half sentences and veiled tones, conversations shifted. Judges began reviewing their own disclosures. Law firms whispered about donations. Clerks revised their resumes. And somewhere inside the vaulted walls of the Supreme Court itself, one justice sat in his office. His name still carved in granite, but his shadow now stretching longer than his legacy. Outside, the country kept talking, not in slogans, but in questions. What is justice? Who gets to define it? And what happens when someone finally calls the question in public? Jasmine Crockett had not promised revolution. She had simply demanded accountability. And for the first time in a long time, the country listened. Not because she shouted louder, but because she refused to be silent when silence was easier. And as the cameras faded, the crowd dispersed, and the headlines found their way to evening broadcasts, Jasmine returned to the one place no one had seen her. Her office, dim and quiet, where the weight of the last 48 hours finally settled not in noise, but in stillness. It was just past 10 p.m. The city outside still pulsed with urgency, but here, the rhythm slowed. No aides lingered, no phones rang. The only sound was the soft hum of the air vent and the barely audible creak of her office chair as she sat down for the first time that day. The room was unchanged. Same frame photo of her parents behind her desk. Same stacks of legislation she hadn't yet had time to review. But something inside her had shifted, subtly, irreversibly. There were moments in public life when a single hour could cleave a career into before and after. She had lived through one. And now in the aftermath, she found herself staring at a yellow folder that had sat untouched on the corner of her desk. It wasn't an evidence file or briefing document. It was her speech, the one she never delivered. She reached for it slowly, sliding her thumb beneath the flap as though unlocking a part of herself she hadn't wanted anyone else to see. Inside were 3 pages, carefully handwritten, edited in the margins, underlined in sections she once thought she might emphasize. The first line hit her harder now than when she wrote it. Justice is not a chair. It's an action, a choice, a refusal to bow. She exhaled softly, not with regret, but with the sobering realization that these words were no longer just an introduction. They were a record. She had written them for the room, for the committee, but now as she reread them, she knew they were always meant for something bigger, for anyone who ever wondered if the system could still respond to truth when spoken plainly, for the student in a lecture hall wondering whether to raise their hand, for the public defender walking into court with a folder full of truth and a judge already set against them, for the woman who had been told 1,000 ways, subtle and blunt, that justice was a table she could sit at but never speak from. The quiet deepened. A shadow moved across the street lamp-lit window. She closed the folder gently and stood. From her second-floor office balcony, she could hear faint voices, like distant waves hitting the shore. They were still there. The students. Law students, policy interns, first-year paralegals who had refused to go home. They had been outside since the hearing ended, even as the media vans pulled away and the Capitol lights dimmed. They weren't chanting. They weren't protesting. They were waiting for something real to emerge from the static. Jasmine walked to the balcony door and paused with her hand on the handle, listening. One student was reading aloud from a printout, Justice Thomas's financial disclosures, her voice trembling but firm. Another was explaining the recusal process to a small cluster of classmates. A few had blankets draped over their shoulders, notebooks balanced on their knees. It wasn't a rally, it was a vigil, for integrity, for answers, for something bigger than any single headline could hold. She stepped outside. The metal railing was cold against her palm. The wind carried the city's tired energy, the kind that stirs when the powerful have been challenged and the powerful don't know how to respond. Slowly, the crowd looked up. They didn't scream. They didn't surge forward. They simply watched, faces illuminated by street lights and phone screens, silent in reverence. Jasmine stood there for a moment, letting the stillness wrap around them all like a protective shield. Then a voice rang out, clear, sharp, from a young woman near the front. "Were you scared?" The question hit like a pin dropped in a cathedral. It wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't sarcastic. It was real, raw, pulled from the heart of every student below who had wondered whether they'd have the strength to stand when it truly mattered. Jasmine didn't hesitate. Her voice echoed downward, not forced, not rehearsed, but full of something that had no name until that very moment. "Of course I was scared," she said, "but I'm more scared of what happens if we stay silent." A beat of stillness followed, not because they didn't hear her, but because they did, fully, viscerally. Some blinked back tears they hadn't realized were there. Others nodded silently, the truth settling on their shoulders like armor. That fear, that unspoken weight, the pressure to stay quiet, to play the game, to keep your head down, it had followed them into classrooms, courtrooms, campaign offices. And now someone had named it, someone who had felt it and still stood. The applause didn't come in a roar. It came like rain, scattered at first, then building, then swelling into something that echoed against the stone facade of the building. It wasn't celebration, it was recognition, a collective understanding that courage isn't about the absence of fear. It's about choosing not to let fear make the final decision. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just stood there absorbing it, not for herself, but for them. For every person who had ever been told that systems don't change, that power doesn't listen, that truth isn't enough. She had walked into a room where that belief was written into the woodwork, and she had rewritten it. She looked down at the folder still in her hand, the one with the speech that never reached the microphone. She didn't regret it. The words had been spoken in other ways, in courtroom silence, in projected emails, in the eyes of agents standing behind glass doors. Still, she unfolded one corner of the page again, rereading it to herself. Justice is not a chair. It's an action. That line, she now knew, had been a prophecy, and she wasn't done acting. She leaned slightly over the balcony, raised her voice one final time for the night, and said, "The fear is real, but so is the power we have when we stop pretending it's someone else's fight." And beneath her, a crowd of future lawyers stood taller, not because she told them to, but because she showed them how. And as Jasmine turned back from the balcony, the students' voices still echoing behind her like a promise, a deeper stillness settled into the room. A silence not of exhaustion, but of meaning. Her office remained quiet, lit only by the muted city lights filtering through the glass. The folder containing her undelivered speech sat untouched on the desk behind her, but its words were no longer confined to paper. They lived in the air now. They lived in the questions people had begun to ask, in the nervous reassessments happening behind closed judicial doors, and in the long overdue conversations shaking loose inside institutions once thought untouchable. But beneath the legal language and procedural fallout, there was something else, something harder to measure, but more enduring. A truth, a lesson, not about law or politics or career strategy, but about what it costs to stand alone when silence is easier. And more than that, what it means when someone finally does. Because make no mistake, Jasmine Crockett didn't arrive at this moment unscarred. She didn't walk into that hearing room without knowing the stakes, or without understanding what it meant to point at power and say, "This is not sacred anymore." She knew there would be backlash, knew she'd be accused of grandstanding, of playing identity politics, of attacking tradition for the sake of headlines. She had seen it before. She'd lived it in 100 small ways. Courtrooms where she was called young lady instead of counselor, hearings where she was told her passion was unbecoming, editorials where her name appeared next to words like divisive, emotional, too ambitious. And yet, she stood, not because she thought it would be easy, but because doing the right thing is almost always the harder choice, and someone had to make it. That is the lesson buried deep inside the story, not wrapped in a soundbite, not boiled down to a slogan, but etched into the human cost of speaking when silence would protect you. Justice is not a chair. It is not a robe. It is not a majority vote or a gavel strike. Justice is a decision made over and over again by people who choose not to look away. In Jasmine's case, that decision came with risk. She didn't have a bench to hide behind. She didn't have lifetime tenure or a media empire. What she had were facts, a voice, and the clarity that comes only when you've been pushed out of too many rooms and finally decide to build your own. And it's in that choice, in that deliberate, spine-stiffening refusal to bow, that her courage becomes something far larger than political confrontation. It becomes a mirror. One she held up not just to Clarence Thomas, not just to the Supreme Court, but to an entire nation raised to believe that the rules are permanent and that power is the same thing as truth. She shattered that illusion, not with rage, not with spectacle, but with persistence, with documents no one could refute, with questions no one wanted to answer, and with a presence so grounded, so undeterred by mockery, that even those who tried to dismiss her could not escape what she made them see. And here lies the second half of the lesson, that power only survives when those without it stop believing they matter. That corruption doesn't need loud defenders when it has quiet enablers. That injustice doesn't always wear a uniform. It sometimes wears a smile and calls itself process. Jasmine called it out. And by doing so, she reminded the country of something radical in its simplicity. The law is not holy. It is human. It is built by us, enforced by us, and therefore it can fail us. And when it does, when the people tasked with protecting it twist it for themselves, it doesn't fix itself. It doesn't apologize. It waits to be challenged. And someone has to be first. That's the loneliness people don't talk about when they talk about justice. The moments before the crowd cheers, the nights before the poll numbers rise, the cold, isolating silence when you submit evidence against someone more powerful than you, and then sit with the possibility that nothing will come of it, that no one will listen, that you'll be left to carry the fallout alone. Jasmine carried that silence. She sat with it, and she kept going anyway. And that, more than any court order or headline, is the soul of what she gave the country. A model not of perfection, but of persistence. A living reminder that real change doesn't begin with thunder. It begins with a whisper that refuses to be quieted. It begins when someone says, "I'm scared," and still takes the microphone. When someone is told to wait their turn and answers, "I think you've had yours." The young woman who asked her, "Were you scared?" didn't just want reassurance. She wanted permission. To feel afraid and still speak. To feel small and still matter. And Jasmine's response, "Of course I was scared, but I'm more scared of what happens if we stay silent," wasn't a rhetorical flourish. It was a blueprint. A hand reaching back across the line between isolation and courage. That's what the students below her balcony were really applauding. Not the scandal, not the drama, but the message underneath it all. That bravery is ordinary people refusing to stay quiet in extraordinary moments. That the only thing more dangerous than corruption is the belief that no one can challenge it. And Jasmine challenged it, not because she was fearless, but because she was honest about her fear and chose to act anyway. The world will remember the suspension order, the FBI presence, the fallout. But long after the dust settles, long after the headlines fade, this story will continue in quieter ways. In a law student who speaks up in class for the first time, in a whistleblower who decides to send the email, in a voter who no longer skips the judicial section of the ballot, in a judge, somewhere, sometime, who reads a case with more care because they remember what it felt like to see justice humbled in public. Those are the ripples Jasmine won't ever fully see, but they are the proof of what she did. Because this isn't a story about taking down a man. It's a story about reminding a country that truth still matters, and that when someone refuses to bow, calmly, clearly, relentlessly, they don't just make history, they make it possible for someone else to believe they can too. And that might be the most human act of all. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.